So millennials are the last generation to have grown up without the internet. And they're also uniquely positioned because they're the only generation to have an analog childhood while experiencing a digital adulthood. They're the only generation that has had to navigate coming out of an age of being disconnected to an age where everything and everyone is connected 24 hours a day. And this presented a unique set of challenges when it comes to adapting to a digital landscape and accepting a reality that you just did not experience as a child. And I think this is the biggest reason why millennials experience nostalgia in an extremely unique way apart from any other generation, because they're the only generation that has had to share these two realities, both the analog reality and now what we have before us, which is this digital reality. Now, there's another reality coming. It's coming in the future, and that is going to be the AI reality, right? And so we have a generation that only knows the internet, but pretty soon there will be a generation that will have experienced an age where it was, internet, 101 or internet 001. And then they'll be the first generation to experience artificial intelligence at a level that's integrated into society in a manner of which we've yet to see. We have not seen yet. And going back to the experience that millennials have and how growing up in an analog childhood and then living in a digital adulthood, the impact that this has on nostalgia for the millennial generation is huge. And it's not just millennials, because you could probably clump some of the Gen Xers in there as well, because they've also experienced this transition. However, with most Gen Xers, they were already well into their adult years by the time the internet became what it is today. Now, why am I talking about this? I'm talking about this because we know that millennials and Gen Xers at this point in game collecting make up a strong percentage of those who are actively engaged in the hobby, especially when it comes to retro video games. We know that the bulk of the individuals who participate in retro game collecting and retro game playing, they're typically going to be millennials to Gen Xers, right? And the question that came to my mind as I think about this all the time is, what happens when old men or older men and women decide that they're no longer going to play or collect video games? What happens to the market? What happens to the idea of retro? What happens to all of this stuff, all of this hardware that we have at our fingertips now to experience these games in their original format? And I think it's something very interesting to consider because, we're seeing where a lot of millennials and I want to say a lot of Gen Xers have kind of already transitioned, right? If you are a Gen Xer and you are someone who was born in the, let's say you were born in the 70s or, late 60s, wherever you fall in that range. Let's just say, for instance, you were born in 1975, right? You're someone who's probably on your last decade of working years, right? You're probably someone who's moving more so into retirement. You're someone who is, thinking about grandbabies. You're in a different phase of life. If you are a millennial, uh, in most cases, you're probably a few years into your marriage. Maybe you're raising, grade school children. Maybe you just purchased your first home. You're kind of engaging you're lifing, right? Life is lifing for you 100%, and it's coming at you full speed. You're no longer really dependent on your parents, or at least you're not trying to be. And your life is progressing for you. And these two groups of individuals are extremely important because they are the ones who financially support the hobby of retro game collecting. And I don't want to say video game collecting as a whole, because when you think about modern consoles like the Switch and the PlayStation 5, you still have parents who are buying a lot of these games for their children. But when it comes to retro video games in particular, the bulk of the individuals who are carrying this market, it feels, and just from what I've seen and from my years on YouTube and just the little research that I've done, a lot of that is really being carried by the Gen Xers, the millennials, and even in some cases the baby boomers. Why? Why is this the case? Well, it's because they're the only ones with the disposable income that care enough about these types of games to actually go out and purchase them. Let's face it, retro games have not been cheap for at least the last half decade, right? They've been fairly expensive. They are coming down in price, especially when you look at some of the more common stuff. But when you look at retro video games as a whole, the common sentiment is that this is a very expensive hobby to participate in. And when you go to retro gaming conventions, when you go to retro gaming swap meets, and I know because I've gone to retro game conventions, I go to the local retro video game swap meets. I deal with video game enthusiasts and vendors, and I've participated in the community, and I've been an active member in the community for over a decade, and really involved with it thanks to YouTube for at least the last half decade. And what I typically tend to see is that the majority of the people who are really buying and collecting these games are either millennials or Gen Xers. Now, it's not to say that there aren't young men in the hobby, but what I tend to see is that young men hustle video games, especially retro games. Young men hustle retro games, and I want to say older men collect video games. They're the ones with the disposable income to keep the stuff that they're buying, to play the games that they're buying. They don't feel the financial pressure to, flip games all the time. They're not, buying and reselling all the time to maintain their collection. They're pretty comfortable with where they're at. And, while yes, there's a younger generation that enjoys retro games from like a, game hunting, flipping, type of perspective, when the end user, and in my opinion, the end user is the place where the game sits, right? This copy of Streets of Rage 2 might go through 4 or 5 conventions, might go through 5 or different trades or swap meets before it actually lands in the hands of a person who says, now this copy is in my collection to stay. And that's what happened with this copy. This copy's been in my collection for years. And honestly, it went from one longtime owner to now me. And with a lot of these games, they eventually find an end user. But what happens when that end user is no longer there? What happens to the games? What happens to the hobby? Who then takes up the mantle and becomes the end user for these products, for these video games, for this original hardware? Now, the common thought is that, a lot of, these games will fall into the land of obscurity because this generation that's coming up will have no nostalgia for them. And I always used to buck against that idea and say, well, maybe for some of the more obscure titles, but this generation, this current generation, this younger generation, they have been exposed to Super Nintendo. They know what GameCube is. They're familiar with some of these consoles and some of these games, even if it's just thanks to, some of these virtual consoles that we get from Nintendo or PlayStation or Xbox. So they'll have some level of familiarity with it. But the difference, I think the big difference that I've come to realize is that this generation that will be the 40 and the 50-year-olds, 20, to 25 years from now, those folks will not have the unique experience of having grown up in an analog era, and then transitioning to a digital era as an adult. All these young people will know is digital. And so I don't know if the nostalgia factor for them is going to hit the same. Maybe they'll have nostalgia for the YouTube videos that they watched that explained some of these older games, right? Maybe they'll think about a Happy Console Gamer or Metal Jesus Rocks or Radical Reggie or one of these pioneers that, Sega Lord X, one of these folks who took time to explain the joy and passion that we felt as kids when it came to some of these retro games, but they will not have the unique experience. And so it's caused me to really question what happens when old men stop playing or collecting video games. What's going to happen when the millennials, the Gen Xers, the baby boomers. What's going to happen when they finally leave the market for good? And I think it's very interesting to think about when you consider just the life perspective of each generation and how it's going to differ going from a generation without internet to a generation with internet to now in the future, a generation with AI. It's very, very interesting, and I'm very interested to know your thoughts here. Let me know down in the comments what you think the answer is, and I'll catch you in the next video. It's the Y2K Collector. Take it easy.